Hi, everyone. I just wanted to wrap up the things they carried with a lecture to help prepare you for the test on Wednesday. The end of the book, I think, is very interesting, and in a way that some of the other books that we've read haven't ended in a satisfactory manner. I feel like the things they carried does end in an interesting way that I find very satisfying. The last time we talked was speaking of courage. That was before the school was canceled. So I'm going to go through some of the stuff in the end of the book. Good form. If you want to go ahead and get your books, that'd be a good idea. You can pause the recording or just reach in and grab it, whatever you want to do. Good form is on 171 in my book. I have the book with the black back cover, and then there's some blue shading on it. So good form is really short. It's a page and a half. If it was printed on a full page without the title, I think it would fill up one page of text. It's really important, though. It's yet another section that relates to metafiction, and that's an important aspect of this work of fiction. The most important idea that comes across in this section is happening truth versus story truth. So what does that mean? Well, here's his quotation. Happening truth. I was once a soldier. There were many bodies, real bodies with real faces. I was young then, and I was afraid to look. And now, 20 years later, I'm left with faceless responsibility and faceless grief. So you see the problematic nature of happening truth, the problematic nature of memory. Tim O'Brien, the narrator, has these feelings and emotions that he's trying to work out, but he can't, because he can't remember the specific images or the specific ideas. And that's the problem with memory. That's the problem with happening truth, what actually happened. In the confusion and the stress of war, you can't always figure those things out. Here's the story truth. He was a slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20. He lay in the center of a red clay trail near the village of My Key. His jaw was in his throat. His one eye was shut. The other eye was a star-shaped hole. I killed him. So the story truth fills in the blanks. It allows Tim O'Brien, the fictional narrator, to view this specific memory and to work through the grief of what happened. That's what the story truth is. So it helps the narrator deal with those memories, but it also helps the reader to understand the emotional truth of what's happened. And that goes all the way back to the epigraph. If you were in Vietnam, you can understand this book. It seems true. If you didn't experience Vietnam, this is the best way to do it. And story truth helps heighten those emotions and convey the truth of what happened emotionally, if not factually. That takes us to notes, which is on page 149. It's the section right after Speaking of Courage, where Norman Bowker circles the lake over and over and over again until he goes and dips his head in the water. What you find out is that Norman Bowker can't tell stories. No one wants to listen, not his father, not his high school girlfriend, and then his friend Max is dead, so he definitely can't tell his stories to him. As a result, Norman Bowker commits suicide, and Tim O'Brien has some guilt. He feels some guilt about this. He's been able to transition to life after Vietnam, but one of the reasons is because he can communicate his experience through stories, which is an advantage that Norman Bowker couldn't have. So instead of, Tim O'Brien doesn't talk about them. He doesn't have friends and go to dinner, but he uses his stories to work through the emotions and the post-traumatic stress and everything else that he's struggling through. This is the fictional narrator, okay? So here is story truth versus happening truth. This is how Notes ends. In the interest of truth, however, I want to make it clear that Norman Bowker was in no way responsible for what happened at Kiowa. Norman did not experience a failure of nerve that night. He did not freeze up or lose the Silver Star for valor. That part of the story is my own. So look at this part. That part of the story is my own. This has two meanings, and it has to do with story truth versus happening truth, okay? That part of the story is my own could mean the fictional Tim O'Brien was the one standing next to Kiowa when the excrement field exploded. The fictional Tim O'Brien, the 23-year-old, tried to pull Kiowa out of the muck, but failed. That can be one interpretation of this sentence. The second interpretation has to do with story truth, okay? Norman Bowker is clearly hurting, stuck in that field. But by adding the fictional detail of Kiowa's death, by turning it into a story, you understand, the reader can understand the emotional trauma that Norman Bowker has been through and why he feels this way and can't get out of this loop going around the lake. So either way, it's either interpretation works. There's no definitive answer. And it's another way that story truth versus happening truth works. Essentially, the narrator, the fictional Tim O'Brien, is saying that part of the story never happened. That's story truth. But the happening truth is about Norman Bowker not being able to move on. So we take this to The Man I Killed. I left off the page number because I want you to go back and reread this and think about the story truth versus happening truth in relation to this story and how that idea plays out. The Lives of the Dead is the closing story, okay? This ends the book. Personally, I love this story, and ever since I first read The Things They Carried, probably in 1994 or 1995, I've been thinking of this story ever since. So it ties together the entire book, which I think is pretty great. It provides an exit ramp for the reader and also the narrator, Tim O'Brien. And then it presents three personae. Little Timmy, self-explanatory. Vietnam Tim, that's the 23-year-old who's dealing with all these experiences. And then the fictional writer, Tim O'Brien, which is not the Tim O'Brien who wrote the book. That guy is in a picture on the back cover. He's got a baseball cap on. In almost all the pictures I've seen in my book, it's a yellow baseball cap. That he also sometimes wears a Boston Red Sox cap, but he's got a lot of different baseball caps. But he's different than the narrator of this book. So there's a lot of plot lines. Some of the plot lines are new. Some of them rehash stories that he's already told. So you've got the first casualty of the war that Tim witnesses. This is the 23-year-old Vietnam Tim, okay? It's the man near the pigsty, and all the men go past and shake the corpse's hand, but Tim O'Brien refuses. So that's a new story. Timmy's first love, Linda. This is the 9-year-old Tim, okay? That's a new story, but if you look at the book as a whole, Linda is first mentioned in On the Rainy River. She is in the parade audience watching Tim O'Brien make his decision about whether to go to Canada or not. At Lavender, we all know that story. You get some more insight into that. Kurt Lemon, that's another story that we've already heard. And then another new one, Loading Corpses with Mitchell Sanders, which the narrator Tim O'Brien says was the worst day of the war. So here's the important simile. It's sort of in the middle of the story. The human life is all one thing, like a blade tracing loops on ice. A little kid, a 23-year-old infantry sergeant, a middle-aged writer, knowing guilt and sorrow. So the simile is here. You've got the like, right? Then you have the human life, and it's like a blade tracing loops on ice. This is an ice skating simile. It relates to the book as a whole. Get to that in a minute. But more immediately, it foreshadows Timmy's dreams about Linda. Timmy, if you remember, goes to bed earlier and earlier so that he can have dreams about Linda and be together with her, even though she's died of the brain tumor. And in one of those dreams, they go ice skating together on a lake and there's floodlights. It also ties together the entire book. So the simile of the skating loops resonates throughout. Let me just add one thing about that. You've got the looping circular analogy already with the rotary. So you have that, but you also have the idea that things stay with you, that memory is a loop, and all of those memories together make a person, or make a human, make a character, whatever you want to say. War stories are never about war. So if you remember the baby water buffalo story, it wasn't about a baby water buffalo. It was about love. It was a love story about the friendship between Brad Kiley and Kurt Lemon. It's also an exit ramp. The reader should understand the ambiguity of the work of fiction. The memory and imagination have spun around the metaphorical rotary and out the story exit. Unlike characters literally or figuratively killed in Vietnam, the fictional narrator Tim O'Brien saves himself with this story. So we're done, right? And then he ends the book with, I'm skimming across the surface of my own history, moving fast, riding the melt beneath the blades, doing loops and spins. And when I take a high leap into the dark and come down 30 years later, I realize it is as Tim trying to save Timmy's life with the story. So if you reflect back on the epigraph, as well as the idea that the real Tim O'Brien left the war behind him and moved on to other subjects, you have the idea that he has encapsulated the truth about Vietnam as he experienced it, as he thinks people need to understand it. And he also never wrote another Vietnam book. There's like allusions and connections to Vietnam, but it's not, he didn't write any more novels set in Vietnam. So that's the end of the book. It's how the whole thing is knitted together. If you have any questions, send me an email or we can chat at office hours. All right. Thanks. More on the test later.